Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 23rd, where we are talking about 28 Days Later, though I also wanted to talk a little bit about the Blair Witch Project. If you remember in our last class, your attendance question was to have you talk a bit about what your thoughts might be for your final project topic, and I will be catching up on the my responses to the discussion forum questions, including that question, as well as your journal assignments over the next several days. And 28 Days Later is a particularly interesting film, I think, considering what we've experienced and maybe still are experiencing with the after effects of COVID-19. And I will never forget teaching this particular film in the spring of 2020. And if you'll remember, the spring of 2020 was when our society shut down. And the first part of the semester, I was teaching this course as a face-to-face. Then we had spring break, and then everything transitioned to an online situation. And it was an incredibly uncertain time. And I remember wondering if this would be an appropriate film to show, because it really is about infection and about the consequences of uncontrolled infection, which seemed quite close to comfort, a little bit too close for comfort, I should say, with what we were experiencing with COVID-19. I'll never forget what my students said is that they wanted to see this film because they thought it would help them navigate those very turbulent times. So again, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but I thought it was an interesting reaction. And this film is oftentimes viewed as a response to the new millennium. It came out in 2022, or I'm sorry, it came out in 2002. And that said, it took a little bit of a while to film, but if you know anything about the transition to the year of 2000, there was great concern about something called Y2K, which was a computer virus, a different kind of infection perhaps, or at least a computer malfunction that programmers had not anticipated the changeover from the 1900s to the 2000s in terms of programming computers for the date of the year. And the concern was that basically the computer systems would go down and that would lead to chaos and perhaps even the ending of the modern society as we knew it. Obviously, that didn't happen. And it's pretty clear that at the beginning of any millennium that you've always got doomsdayers who are always talking about the ending of the world, but that technological issue seemed to increase the stakes. And it also goes to show how little we really understood about what was happening with the creation of the internet and the consequences of its creation, which gets us back to the Blair Witch Project, where many respects, I see that film as anticipating some of the technological challenges that we experienced in the 2000s and are experiencing today. But in terms of thinking about today's attendance question, I'm going to merge those two films, The Blair Witch Project and 28 Days Later, by asking you which of the two do you think best represents the cultural anxieties of its time and why? The Blair Witch Project being a representation of the 1990s, and 28 Days Later being a representation of the 2000s. Now, of course, when people think of the 2000s, they usually think about 9/11. And that said, this film was not filmed in response to 9/11 because they began shooting before that, even though the film was released after that. So, in an opening scene, for instance, that seems eerily like 9/11, where you've got bulletin boards that are posting missing person information, which was the case in Manhattan during 9/11. That was more in response to some of the global catastrophes that had occurred. And in fact, Danny Boyle, the director of this particular film, who happens to be British. So, in this way, this film is different than some of the other films we've seen. Yes, we began with a German film, The Cabinet and Dr. Caligari, but we have always focused on American films. So now we get a different kind of perspective by focusing on Britain. And Danny Boyle will talk about that he was talking about things like mad cow disease, and the idea of illness and disease that could go unchecked. And of course, no one had any kind of inkling of what a COVID 19 would bring to us 20 years or so later. This film has not necessarily achieved the cultural status that our text projected fears thought it would, and that I personally thought it would. I really think it is a superb film, and I'm not exactly sure why. That said, if you know anything about the franchise, there was a sequel 28 weeks later, which was, in my opinion, mediocre. But now there is a trilogy that is out, the latest one being The Bone Temple, that is set in around the same time period. And I highly recommend The Bone Temple in particular. But what we've got is a zombie tale that isn't a zombie tale. One of the things that George Romero went to his grave saying was that 28 Days Later could never be a zombie tale because it violated all of the expectations of what we would assume a zombie would have, expectations that Romero himself created. Of course, zombies aren't real, so we can perhaps debate that. Danny Boyle, the director, says that he was directly influenced by George Romero. The distinction being is that these entities are not dead, they are infected, so they haven't risen up back to life. They're infected with something called a rage virus, not so thinly veiled reference to the idea about how rage can be transferred from individual to individual. One of the opening scenes we see, and it's reminiscent of Clockwork Orange, if you're familiar with that film, is a primate being subjected to watching media, violent media. And again, I think it kind of anticipates not only the concerns that we have with the 24/7 news cycle nowadays, but also social media and doom scrolling and how that ultimately impacts rage and the psychology of rage. Um, Hatred and violence is universal and contagious. And that said, we have a society that, much like in George Romero's zombie world, is critical of the media, critical of the government, critical of the military. This is also critical consumerism. So if you know anything about perhaps George Romero's most famous film, as famous as Night of the Living Dead is, it's Dawn of the Dead, which was a direct commentary on consumerism, that individuals continue to consume much like zombies continue to eat and are never satisfied. The message in this film, though, I think, and there are many messages, is the importance of community and others. Remember, Night of the Living Dead ended in a very bleak way. And that what we saw was the collapse of individuals being able to work together as a unit. And without giving away too many spoilers for 28 Days Later, we will see something different. So pay close attention to the first word we hear in the film that's uttered, which is hello, and how important that will be to the ending of the film. Again, I don't want to give too much away. And through the film, what we see is a kind of creation of a new society, a new family. It's one of the things that I really enjoy about the film is that we've got a group of survivors who band together and look out for each other, kind of creating a new familial unit. And they're no longer concerned with some of the petty issues that we've been concerned with in the past. So things like class or things like ethnicity seem to have little relevance with this group that is formed together. And that's the first part of the film. The second part of the film is, in some ways, almost a different movie. And it's about the military and the military's role in community. or the military's role in a lack of community. And if you know George Romero's third film, which is Day of the Dead, it was a direct response to the idea of military. So it seems that Danny Boyle was inspired, shall we say, by two George Romero films. The way that this film is different is in its portrayal of the quote zombies unquote or the infected, that they are fast, and some have argued that that is a great commentary of the 2000s where things were moving increasingly faster because of technology. I can't help but think of where we are with AI now, where things are literally changing almost by the day. Not that anybody could have anticipated that in the early 2000s. Also note that the world continues on even when humanity may not. Those are some of the most beautiful scenes in the film. There's one where we've got some horses that are running wild, and those horses are black and white. And I think that's also a commentary on the idea of the familial unit that we see, where we've got Selena, who is black, and we've got our main character played by Cillian Murphy, Jim, who is white. And again, those issues that might have made so much of a difference in pre-infection society are absolutely meaningless. Now, this was before Cillian Murphy became this huge star in the way that he is now. And I think this film uses sound particularly well. We've talked about other films using sound particularly well. Things like soundtracks, for instance, that have become iconic, such as the Psycho soundtrack or the Halloween soundtrack or even the Exorcist soundtrack. You'll note that one of the things that I had assigned for you to read today was from the horror film book, Chapter 7, about spooky sounds and the importance of audio and silence. Silence can heighten fear. So if you know the film A Quiet Place, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. And silence and then jarring loud noises. It's a technique the exorcist would use as well, that it would go from silence to loud jarring noises to disorient the viewer. If nothing else, perhaps the message of the film is that quarantine can be effective. And that was an issue that we were grappling with in the early 2000s. But again, I don't want to give away too much about this particular film. You can obviously see it on streaming services. You can see it in Interlibrary Loan. And once again, I was able to find a free link online, so I've provided that to you as well. And I've also provided what our last film will be of the semester, which will be next week. And that film is Get Out. And it really is the inspiration for this particular course, actually. I remember seeing Get Out in the movie theaters and thinking that it was such a masterpiece that I really needed to create a class in horror film, and this is the result of that experience. It came out in 2017, and I have been searching for a film for the 2020s, and I think I might have found it. I think it may be Sinners, which I have mentioned to you before. A zombie tale, or I'm sorry, a vampire tale that is also a great historical overview of Black history. But I'll talk a little bit more about Sinners. I highly recommend that you see it if you haven't already. But our class attendance question, again, is trying to combine what we watched last week, The Blair Witch Project, with what we are watching this week, 28 Days Later. That out of the two, which do you think best represents the cultural anxieties of its time and why? And I'll talk a little bit more about 28 Days Later next class and prepare us for ultimately our last full feature-length film, Get Out, from 2017. Your discussion forum responses due Saturday on the 25th, but of course, as you know, if you need additional time, please let me know, and I will be catching up with my grading for both the discussion forum responses and your journals. And as you know, for our final project, you have the opportunity to select something that is of interest to you for the final project. So many of you will probably write about a film that we've seen in class. Many of you will probably do a traditional academic paper, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And our very final class, which is when your final project would be due, is when we will have our final examination. And this is a way for you to basically synthesize everything that we've talked about in the semester. So for the final examination, it will be an essay exam. I will give you a couple of essay questions and ask you to choose, so you will have some choice there. And it will be open book, open notes, so you can reference the class materials. And you would have 24 hours in which to do that examination, because if we were taking this exam in a face-to-face situation, you would have approximately 2 to 3 hours to take the exam. So I am going to be posting that, and on the day in which our class would normally meet, and you would have 24 hours in which to respond to that particular essay question. And I'm certainly not expecting anything as well developed or as well written as what you might do with a final project, because obviously you've had weeks for the final project and you're only going to have a couple of hours perhaps for your final exam. And that's how long you should spend, even though I've set aside 24 hours for you to respond to that. Basically, you should spend somewhere in the area of no more than 3 hours or so responding to the question. And the idea is that you can think about the class holistically. So if you'll remember, I have been posting our class videos and our notes in our Moodle site at the top of the page with past class sessions. And of course, the best way to prepare for this exam is to have seen all the movies, to have done all the readings, to have watched all the videos. You might want to reread some of my notes or rewatch some of the videos or even rewatch some of the films, depending. You don't know necessarily which film or films you would be writing about. So the best way to prepare is to have done everything. So, and that's really the purpose of the final exam, is that you've been keeping up with the work over the semester. So it's just a question of you trying to pull it all together. And we'll talk a little bit more about the final examination as we get a bit closer to actually taking it. And we'll continue to talk a little bit more about the final project. But we're at the point in the semester where you should be seriously thinking about the final project. And if you're still not certain how to proceed with the final project, we have yet one more film. I suggest you watch it sooner rather than later, and that film is Get Out, because that might be the film that will serve as your inspiration. But we will talk about that next class. So, as you can see, that 28 Days Later is a rather long film. It's slightly under 2 hours. It's an hour and 53 minutes. So I'm just going to end it here. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.